Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better. Is there a hierarchy of emotions? Arthur Auken Lovejoy wrote the definitive book of intellectual history on the Great Chain of Being. I've read his The Great Chain of Being twice, and if the topic interests you, I highly recommend it. As Lovejoy chronicles the idea that some beings are higher than others, the idea that there is a hierarchy of beings is found in philosophers and other intellectuals throughout the Western canon. It's found, for example, in Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, Augustine, Abelard, Aquinas, Averroes, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, Schlegel, Schelling, and Bergson. It's also found in other intellectuals such as Dante, Bruno, Kepler, Pope, Edison, Moore, Pascal, Haller, Bonnet, Diderot, Bolingbroke, and Schleiermacher. Lovejoy's book was published in 1936, or he likely would have added more examples. The idea that there is a scale of beings that can be arranged from lowest to highest is not only a powerful idea, but also it's a simple one. It could be as simple as, for example, starting with rocks and other inorganic matter, ascending to plants, then ascending to non-human animals, and then to human animals. Some even extend the great chain from humans upwards through a hierarchy of angels to God. There are other powerful ideas associated with it, such as the idea that the universe is full, which is the principle of plenitude, and the idea that the universe is rational, which is the principle of sufficient reason. If we imagine a temporal rather than a non-temporal or static chain, there in embryonic form is the idea of evolution. If we associate levels of consciousness with the kinds of beings in the great chain, we have the intellectual background for thinking that there are different levels or kinds of consciousness. There aren't. Although I sometimes use it because it's a familiar way of talking and it's misleading. All consciousness is the same. Consciousness, awareness, doesn't have different kinds. This follows from Brentano's famous principle of the intentionality of consciousness. He's not using the word intentionality in the ordinary way. As he wrote in Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint, every mental phenomenon is characterized by what the scholastics of the Middle Ages called the intentional or mental inexistence of an object, and what we might call reference to a content, direction toward an object. Every mental phenomenon includes something as object within itself. He means by object what we mean by form, which is anything that can be singled out for attention. In other words, at least in the domain of becoming, there's no such thing as empty consciousness. To be conscious is to be conscious of some form, some object or other. If you are skeptical of Brentano's thesis, as you should be, try to distinguish for yourself different kinds of consciousness without referring to what they are about, their objects. Is there, for example, any difference between perceiving something and remembering something? Are perceiving and remembering two different kinds of consciousness? No. It's just that what they are about, namely their forms or objects, are, or may be, different. At least that's the way my mind works. If so, there are no different kinds or levels of consciousness. If so, there can be no different levels of consciousness in which some are higher or better than others. My considered recommendation, then, is always to translate propositions about different kinds or levels of consciousness into propositions about different kinds of forms. For example, there's dream consciousness, when we experience temporal distortion and the suspension of ordinary laws of causality, such as when, say, I think I'm riding on Pegasus, or aware of having a conversation with the Buddha. Similarly, there's perceptual consciousness when we see or hear or smell or touch or taste everyday forms. The cash value of all this is that there are different domains of experience. Those who are blind do not experience colors. Those who are deaf do not experience sounds. And so on. Here's the important question to ask yourself. Could I be lacking experience of different domains? My answer? Not only could you, but it's also almost certain that you are so lacking. I previously offered a concrete example, namely, living without fear. That's not an experience that non-sages ever have. As I argue in subsequent videos, it's not that sages are necessarily somehow better or more valuable people than we are. It's that we non-sages are limited in our experiences. We don't want to be limited. This explains why, when we briefly experience a so-called higher level of consciousness, we want more of it. More accurately and clearly, it's not that we want a different kind of consciousness. Again, there are no different kinds of consciousness. It's that the range of forms we non-sages experience is more limited than the range of forms sages experience. We naturally value the fullness of life's experiences. We want so-called higher experiences when we are exposed to them. That's just our nature. Fulfillment comes from realizing our true nature. We naturally want to experience our true nature. Doing that is being a sage. There will be more about realizing our true nature in subsequent videos. I just don't want you to be confused by terminology about being or about different levels or kinds of consciousness. I may occasionally talk about different levels of consciousness, for example, but that's just a way of talking that some may find helpful. I don't mean that there are different levels of consciousness. Again, all consciousness is the same. There's only one kind. Different episodes of consciousness differ solely because of what they are about, their forms or objects. Now that we have the general idea of a hierarchy in which some kinds are better than others, in the next video in this series, let's consider the idea of a great hierarchy of emotions. Let's end emotional distress.